how this is going to affect the ICT in total and society, especially with respect to red alerts?
Yeah, I'd like to answer that question for you, actually, Glenn. I mean, my view is that it's far too early to tell whether that's going to be a problem, because we're also going through this transition. Sorry? Yeah, but the issue is to what extent the desktop matters anymore. Because there's this transition towards tablets and smartphones. I mean, well, no, they're not shrinking, but the point is they're staying where they are. But in terms of new purchases, people aren't buying desktops. Well, people in the home don't buy desktops anymore. You don't see anyone with desktops. People buy tabs.
Well, the trends on accessing data also are very interesting, because they indicate that in many environments, developed and developing countries, people are bypassing their tethered or semi-tethered devices in favor of mobile access.
Yeah. I mean, we take a very Western-centric view of things. I mean, in developing countries, as Keith says, I mean, people are using mobile as the primary way of accessing this stuff. We're the past. You know, desktops, you're right, aren't going away, but it's, you know, it's a relic of a previous era. And I think we get too fixated on what happened in the West in the past. And you really need to look at what's happening in India and in China, in Africa. And I don't think that those issues are that important there. What's much more important is what happens in mobile. Well, that's us in a Western country in Brussels.
Yeah.
So, do you want to?
Yeah, I just want to sort of contextualize this in a sense. You know, my experience of Linux, which actually reading Glyn's book was my first experience of Linux, and I then went out the following weekend pretty much and built a mail server for our company, for the company I ran and owned. Because our proprietary mail server wasn't working, and it worked permanently. It worked permanently after that. But you know, my experience from Linux and the open source world, and you know, there's always the thing about it's free as in free speech, not free beer. And I think the free speech is really, really important. I think the free speech and the free thought is really important, and this is why. All of these laws are so troubling, because we've got an accretion of additional restrictions on our ability to say, do, think. And I think that I mean, when you go back to this, I mean, I was a very bad maths graduate, but I always go back to first principles. Why do we have these restrictions? Why do we have copyright? You know, it's to foster creativity. You know, I struggle to see how, you know, somebody having rights 25 years after their death fosters any creativity. But, you know, but generally those issues, you know, the restrictions on the ability to copy, the restrictions on being able to copy other people's ideas are there for the good of society. The ability to say what we think, the ability to combine this bit of data with that bit of data and come to our conclusions. You know, fundamentally, what we're talking about here is democracy. You know, democracy is about the ability to, you know, for two people to hear the same speech, read the same pamphlets, you know, hear the same arguments and come up with a different view, and be able to have the same right to do something, irrespective of how much, of what education they have, irrespective of how much money they have. It's about that, you know, it's fundamentally comes to that. And what we're seeing, I think, is we're seeing a jurisdictional crisis where governments have got less and less power within their borders. So, you know, and that is resulting in two things. One is that they exercise power where they can, which tends to be over those with the weakest people who can't, you know, move countries, who can't basically base themselves, you know, from a legal perspective somewhere else, who can't just, you know, jump on a plane. And we're seeing this rise of global legislation, but because it's global legislation, there's a whole process that goes to it, and therefore the only people involved are those people with power. So I think that you know, my first instinct would be to really try to stop governments making any legislation about this sort of stuff. unless that they can really persuasively show and persuasively explain to people why there's a public interest in terms of doing this, and I don't think they're doing this. So I think fundamentally what we have, all of these things, is an underlying battle for freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and for democracy.
I mean, I agree absolutely. I think the issue is, what do we do about it? And maybe a tiny step that you can take is by demanding transparency for those kind of negotiations, because they're not going to stop doing it yet. But they can't fight the idea that we should know at least what's going on. I think ACTA is a good example of that. When we knew what was going on there, then people started getting angry and started doing things. But there were 4 years of negotiations when a few people knew what was going on, but nothing happened. It was only when the anger was sort of diffuse. Yeah. So maybe the first step is fighting.
And the Parliament, the involvement of
Yes,
the European Parliament.
that's right. So I know we've got other comments on how we can try and make things better, given that the consensus seems to be things are quite bad. Okay, what are we going to do about it rather than just sit here saying it's bad?
I do hope people have paid note, by the way, to the fact that you know already that if you're going to try and get legislation through without socialising it with the rest of your colleagues in the European Parliament, that you're going to have a problem when it comes to the vote. Just take note that if you don't socialise legislation with Europe's citizens, you're going to have trouble getting that legislation through when it comes to the riot. Because there will be one now, because we're now paying attention. You can't slip through software patents like everyone tried to in 2005. You can't slip through copyright maximalism like people tried to in ACTA. We will notice, and so the process needs to be adapted to take into account the fact that this connected creator-consumer citizenry is actually paying attention now. And we're going to make very sure that there's a reaction if you fail to socialise legislation with us in advance. To the point about, I'm very worried about using kill chips to restrict what software can run in desktops. I know that Glyn no longer uses a desktop. He's a laptop-only man now. It does concern me. I actually think that it's an antitrust issue. I think that we had hoped that the era of antitrust against abusive corporations was over with the resolution of all the cases against Microsoft. But I fear that that is not the case. I fear that we will find ourselves engaging in antitrust once again on behalf of Europe's citizens against abusive corporations who don't want to allow other operating systems to run, for example, on their Apple hardware, or who don't want to allow other operating systems to run on their phones. I think that that is going to be a matter that we need to see the European Commission seizing strong hold of bravely. I do hope that the spirit of Neelie Kroes will live on in being willing to face down those antitrust issues bravely and not letting abusive corporations just get away with it.
Keith, what about in the US?
Well, I think to follow on to the point Simon's making, I think it's important that even when there's vigilant action, as there was here around interconnection and requiring interoperability, it's interesting to note that Microsoft is now utilizing its active synchronization patents. It has 10 patents which it utilizes on a serial basis to assert and litigate against companies, because what we've done, not intentionally but unintentionally, is created this honeypot that attracts everyone to utilize. We've abandoned the open source project that was focused, portion of the project that was focused on active synchronization. And we thought, even though I remember quotes that, we've won, we've gotten this, they're going to have to allow for interoperability and synchronization. Problem is, we didn't impose a burden that there would be FRAND or RAND licensing on the patents that they held, and we gave them explicitly the right to utilize those patents out into the future. What happened is, for instance, the suit by Microsoft against Motorola, they were charging one fee. Motorola was the first licensee for those patents 6-7 years ago. Then when it came time for renewal, they had trebled the amount that they were charging because now everybody was locked into utilizing this approach. And so Motorola basically said, forget that, sue us. And so that created a situation of contention because we didn't think it through at the commission level to impose a burden of fair and reasonable royalties when we allowed them the right to utilize their patents. And so those are situations that are very important. I think one of the things holistically that we have to back up and look at is that we're talking a lot about what can be done around patents, what can be done around representation for small, medium-sized enterprises. Well, one thing that we haven't really addressed is the fact that the shock from '07 is the people that feel it the worst are small, medium-sized enterprise, because capital has dried up. There's plenty of available capital at banks, but no willingness to actually loan money. I mean, the Secretary of the Treasury in the United States has made multiple visits to banks, regional banks, trying to tell them, look, you've got to start lending money. We gave you all this money. We're giving it to you at concessionary terms. Put it out. These people, you can't make them put it out. So government has to now recognize, I mean, 85% of what we focus on at OIN is small, medium-sized enterprises, because that's where innovation comes from. Innovation comes from the edge, not from the core. The community's lifeblood is the edge, is the individual developer, is the small, medium-sized company that's struggling to be able to get capital, to be able to advance a product to market, and then be able to sell it. And those companies without access to debt capital are really challenged. They have to make decisions that either to go out of business or take equity capital, which they shouldn't have to bring in at much higher dollar figures. Plus, the equity markets have dried up so that we don't have as much venture money, particularly in Europe. Silicon Valley is still okay, but Research Triangle Park, Route 128 in Boston, very much down from where they were. So these are all things that we have to think about in terms of the context of innovation. We're robbing those entities that are our greatest source of innovation, and putting more burden on corporations to invest in them or the venture community, and they are actually have pulled back in the same time frame.
So we've got to sort out the governments and the banks to get this right.
Yeah.
Okay, Carla. Oh, sorry, you want to go?
Yes, I just wanted to add that from a consumer point of view, the lack of openness, or openness in general, is it seems to us that it's really a business case. It is a conscious choice made, and generally when this is not meeting the public interest, the antidote or the way to fix it is generally competition law. And what we would like to see maybe a bit more is the use of competition law, antitrust cases, examples like that, because you don't have to forget that the competition law is one of the arms of consumer protection. It is a way to, of course, controlling the market, but also to making the market delivering if the market is not delivering. So this is something that maybe could be used a bit more, and we also see it in the standardization setting, because you know very well that patents are generally, or can be, or shouldn't be, incorporated into standards, and there are a lot of rules around it. But maybe those rules also would need to be looked at and refreshed, because we have the impression that a lot is going on unnoticed in the standardization process about patents, with the effect that then it has an effect on the market, of course. And then again, the standardization or the regulation process not meeting the public interest, but meeting only some very powerful corporation interest,